Welcome to my channel Sleep Audio Stories. Thank you for watching. Video, subscribe, and like my channel.
The Abominations of Yondo by Clark Ashton Smith. The sand of the desert of Yondo is not as the sand of other deserts, for Yondo lies nearest of all to the world's rim, and strange winds, blowing from a gulf no astronomer may hope to fathom, have sown its ruinous fields with the gray dust of corroding planets, the black ashes of extinguished suns. The dark orb-like mountains which rise from its wrinkled and pitted plain are not all its own, for some are fallen asteroids, half buried in that abysmal sand. Things have crept in from nether space, whose incursion is forbid by the gods of all proper and well-ordered lands, but there are no such gods in Yondo, where live the hoary genii of stars abolished, and decrepit demons left homeless by the destruction of antiquated hells. It was noon of a vernal day when I came forth from that interminable cactus forest in which the inquisitors of Ong had left me, and saw at my feet the gray beginnings of Yondo. I repeat, it was noon of a vernal day, but in that fantastic wood I had found no token or memory of spring, and the swollen, fulvous, dying, and half-rotten growth through which I had pushed my way were like no other cacti, but bore shapes of abomination scarcely to be described. The very air was heavy with stagnant odors of decay, and leprous lichens mottled the black soil and russet vegetation with increasing frequency. Pale green vipers lifted their heads from prostrate cactus bowls and watched me with eyes of bright ochre that had no lids or pupils. These things had disquieted me for hours past, and I did not like the monstrous fungi, with hueless stems and nodding heads of poisonous mauve, which grew from the sodden lips of fetid tarns, and the sinister ripples spreading and fading on the yellow water at my approach were not reassuring to one whose nerves were still taut from unmentionable tortures. Then, when even the blotched and sickly cacti became more sparse and stunted, and rills of ashen sand crept in among them, I began to suspect how great was the hatred my heresy had aroused in the priests of Ong, and to guess the ultimate malignancy of their vengeance. I will not detail the indiscretions which had led me, a careless stranger from far-off lands, into the power of those dreadful magicians and mysteriarchs who served the lion-headed Ong. These indiscretions and the particulars of my arrest are painful to remember, and least of all do I like to remember the racks of dragon gut strewn with powdered adamant, on which men are stretched naked, or that unlit room with 6-inch windows near the sill, where bloated corpse worms crawled in by hundreds from a neighboring catacomb. Sufficient to say that, after expending the resources of their frightful fantasy, my inquisitors had borne me blindfolded on camelback for incomputable hours, to leave me at morning twilight in that sinister forest. I was free, they told me, to go whither I would, and in token of the clemency of Ong, they gave me a loaf of coarse bread and a leathern bottle of rank water by way of provision. It was at noon of the same day that I came to the desert of Yondo. So far, I had not thought of turning back for all the horror of those rotting cacti or the evil things that dwelt among them. Now I pause, knowing the abominable legend of the land to which I had come, for Yondo is a place where few have ventured wittingly and of their own accord. Fewer still have returned, babbling of unknown horrors and strange treasure, and the lifelong palsy which shakes their withered limbs, together with the mad gleam in their starting eyes beneath whitened brows and lashes, is not an incentive for others to follow. So it was that I hesitated on the verge of those ashen sands, and felt the tremor of a new fear in my wrenched vitals. It was dreadful to go on, and dreadful to go back, for I felt sure that the priests had made provision against the latter contingency. So after a little, I went forward, sinking at each step in loathly softness, and followed by certain long-legged insects that I had met among the cacti. These insects were the color of a week-old corpse, and were large as tarantulas. But when I turned and trod upon the foremost, a mephitic stench arose that was more nauseous even than their color. So for once, I ignored them as much as possible. Indeed, such things were minor horrors in my predicament, Before me, under a huge sun of sickly scarlet, Yondo reached, interminable as the land of a hashish dream against the black heavens. Far off, on the utmost rim, were those orb-like mountains of which I have told. But in between were awful blanks of gray desolation, and low treeless hills like the back of half-buried monsters. Struggling on, I saw gray pits where meteors had sunk from sight, and divers colored jewels that I could not name glared or glistened from the dust. There were fallen cypresses that rotted by crumbling mausoleums, on whose lichen-blotted marble fat chameleons crept with royal pearls in their mouths. Hidden by the low ridges were cities of which no stela remained unbroken, immense and immemorial cities lapsing shard by shard, atom by atom, to feed infinities of desolation. I dragged my torture-weakened limbs over vast rubbish heaps that had once been mighty temples, and fallen gods frowned in rotting samite, or leered in riven porphyry at my feet. Over all was an evil silence, broken only by the satanic laughter of hyenas, and the rustling of adders in thickets of dead thorn or antique gardens given to the perishing nettle and fumitory. Topping one of many mound-like ridges, I saw the waters of a weird lake, unfathomably dark and green as malachite, and set with bars of profulgent salt. These waters lay far beneath me in a cup-like hollow, but almost at my feet on the wave-worn slopes were heaps of that ancient salt, and I knew that the lake was only the bitter and ebbing dregs of some former sea. Climbing down, I came to the dark waters, and began to lave my hands. But there was a sharp and corrosive sting in that immemorial brine, and I desisted quickly, preferring the desert dust that had wrapped me about like a slow shroud. Here I decided to rest for a little, and hunger forced me to consume part of the meager and mocking fare with which I had been provided by the priests. It was my intention to push on if my strength would allow, and reach the lands that lie to the north of Yondo. These lands are desolate, indeed, but their desolation is of a more usual order than that of Yondo, and certain tribes of nomads have been known to visit them occasionally. If fortune favored me, I might fall in with one of these tribes. The scant fare revived me, and for the first time in weeks of which I had lost all reckoning, I heard the whisper of a faint hope. The corpse-colored insects had long since ceased to follow me, and so far, despite the eeriness of the sepulchral silence and the mounded dust of timeless ruin, I had met nothing half so horrible as those insects. I began to think that the terrors of Yondo were somewhat exaggerated. It was then that I heard a diabolic chuckle on the hillside above me. The sound began with a sharp abruptness that startled me beyond all reason, and continued endlessly, never varying its single note like the mirth of an idiotic demon. I turned and saw the mouth of a dark cave, fanged with green stalactites, which I had not perceived before. The sound appeared to come from within this cave. With a fearful intentness, I stared at the black opening. The chuckle grew louder, but for a while I could see nothing. At last I caught a whitish glimmer in the darkness. Then, with all the rapidity of nightmare, a monstrous thing emerged. It had a pale, hairless, egg-shaped body, large as that of a gravid she-goat, and this body was mounted on 9 long, wavering legs with many phalanges, like the legs of some enormous spider. The creature ran past me to the water's edge, and I saw that there were no eyes in its oddly sloping face, but 2 knife-like ears rose high above its head, and a thin, wrinkled snout hung down across its mouth, whose flabby lips, parted in that eternal chuckle, revealed rows of bat's teeth. It drank avidly of the bitter lake. Then, with thirst satisfied, it turned and seemed to sense my presence, for the wrinkled snout rose and pointed toward me, sniffing audibly. Whether the creature would have fled or whether it meant to attack me, I do not know, for I could bear the sight no longer, but ran with trembling limbs amid the massive boulders and great bars of salt along the lake shore. Utterly breathless, I stopped at last, and saw that I was not pursued. I sat down, still trembling, in the shadow of a boulder. But I was to find a little respite, for now began the second of those bizarre adventures which forced me to believe all the mad legends I had heard. More startling even than that diabolic chuckle was the scream that rose at my very elbow. From the salt-compounded sand, the scream of a woman possessed by some atrocious agony, or helpless in the grip of devils. Turning, I beheld a veritable Venus, naked in a white perfection that could fear no scrutiny, but immersed to her navel in the sand. Her terror-widened eyes implored me, and her lotus hands reached out, with beseeching gesture. I sprang to her side and touched a marble statue, whose carven lids were drooping in some enigmatic dream of dead cycles, and whose hands were buried with the lost loveliness of hips and thighs. Again I fled, shaken with a new fear, and again I heard the scream of a woman's agony, but this time I did not turn to see the imploring eyes and hands. Up the long slope to the north of that accursed lake, stumbling over boulders of basanite and ledges that were sharp with verdigris-covered metals, floundering in pits of salt on terraces wrought by the receding tide and ancient eons, I fled as a man flies from dream to baleful dream of some cacodemoniacal night. At whiles there was a cold whisper in my ear which did not come from the wind of my flight, and looking back as I reached one of the upper terraces, I perceived a singular shadow that ran pace by pace with my own. This shadow was not the shadow of man nor ape, nor any known beast. The head was too grotesquely elongated, the squat body too gibbous, and I was unable to determine whether the shadow possessed 5 legs or whether what appeared to be the 5th was merely a tail. Terror lent me new strength, and I had reached the hilltop when I dared to look back again. But still the fantastic shadow kept pace by pace with mine, and now I caught a curious and utterly sickening odor, foul as the odor of bats who have hung in a charnel house amid the mold of corruption. I ran for leagues while the red sun slanted above the asteroidal mountains to the west, and the weird shadow lengthened with mine but kept always at the same distance behind me. An hour before sunset I came to a circle of small pillars that rose miraculously unbroken amid ruins that were like a vast pile of potsherds. As I passed among these pillars, I heard a whimper, like the whimper of some fierce animal between rage and fear, and saw that the shadow had not followed me within the circle. I stopped and waited, conjecturing at once that I had found a sanctuary my unwelcome familiar would not dare to enter. And in this the action of the shadow confirmed me, for the thing hesitated, then ran about the circle of columns, pausing often between them, and, whimpering all the while, at last went away and disappeared in the desert toward the setting sun. For a full half-hour I did not dare to move. Then the imminence of night, with all its probabilities of fresh terror, urged me to push on as far as I could to the north, for I was now in the very heart of Yondo, where demons or phantoms might dwell who would not respect the sanctuary of the unbroken columns. Now as I toiled on, the sunlight altered strangely, for the red orb, nearing the mounded horizon, sank and smoldered in a belt of miasmal haze where floating dust from all the shattered fanes and necropoli of Yondo was mixed with evil vapors coiling skyward from black enormous gulfs lying beyond the utmost rim of the world. In that light, the entire waste, the rounded mountains, the serpentine hills, the lost cities, were drenched with phantasmal and darkening scarlet. Then, out of the north, where shadows mustered, there came a curious figure, a tall man fully caparisoned in chainmail, or rather what I assumed to be a man. As the figure approached me, clanking dismally at each step on the sharded ground, I saw that its armor was of brass mottled with verdigris, and a casque of the same metal, furnished with coiling horns and a serrat comb, rose high above its head. I say its head, for the sunset was darkening, and I could not see clearly at any distance. But when the apparition came abreast, I perceived that there was no face beneath the brows of that bizarre helmet, whose empty edges were outlined for a moment against the smoldering light. Then the figure passed on, still clanking dismally, and vanished. But on its hills, ere the sunset faded, there came a second apparition, striding with incredible strides, and halting when it loomed almost upon me in the red twilight, the monstrous mummy of some ancient king, still crowned with untarnished gold, but turning to my gaze a visage that more than time or the worm had wasted. Broken swathings flapped about the skeleton legs, and above the crown that was set with sapphires and orange rubies, a black something swayed and nodded horribly. But, for an instant, I did not dream what it was. Then, in its middle, two oblique and scarlet eyes opened and glowed like hellish coals, and two ophidian fangs glittered in an ape-like mouth. A squat, furless, shapeless head on a neck of disproportionate extent leaned unspeakably down and whispered in the mummy's ear. Then, with one stride, the titanic lich took half the distance between us, and from out the folds of the tattered cere-cloth a gaunt arm arose, and fleshless taloned fingers, laden with glowering gems, reached out and fumbled for my throat. Back through eons of madness and dread, in a prone, precipitate flight, I ran from those fumbling fingers that hung always on the dusk behind me. Back forever, unthinking, unhesitating to all the abominations I had left. Back in the thickening twilight, toward the nameless and sharded ruins. The haunted lake, the forest of evil cacti, and the cruel and cynical inquisitors of Ong, who wait my return. The Wraith, by Dora Sagerson Shorter. John O'Driscoll walked up and down the little boreen that led to the wood, his heart bitter within him. A young moon looked down upon him silently. A bird twittered sleepily in the hedge close by, disturbed no doubt by his restless tread. He was a jealous man, John O'Driscoll, and quick to fly suspicious. He drew forth his watch and glanced at it impatiently. It was still warm from the hot hand that had closed upon it but a moment before. Mary Ryan was late at the trysting place where so often she arrived before her time. Her father was from home tonight, and her mother was his friend. There was nothing to keep her, nothing except her own desires. James Farrell loved her. Was there anything in that? John O'Driscoll ground his heel into the path and cursed below his breath. Over the crooked bridge that led to the trysting place a little figure came, white-cheeked and frightened-eyed. She ran looking over her shoulder, so she stumbled often on her way. John O'Driscoll sat forlorn at the foot of the great tree that so often listened to his love story, and never till tonight beheld him deserted. His eyes were hot with anger, and his heart cold within him, so that when the little flying figure came towards him with outspread arms, he had no welcome for it. She sat weeping beside him, but did not attempt to embrace him. She clasped her empty hands loosely before her, and bent her sad gaze upon him, fearful of his anger. "I would have been with you," she said, "long ago, but for a strange thing that passed me on the road." She shuddered, as if with the cold. "And what was that?" said John O'Driscoll roughly, "that kept you so late? I am weary waiting you." "It was the corpse of a young girl," she said. Her eyes looked as though she had seen a vision, "and she shrouded all in white from head to foot." "Who was she?" said John O'Driscoll, and his voice softened to tenderness. "Some friend you loved? Some comrade you could ill spare? Otherwise, I know you would not have deserted your own true love and left him here to mourn your absence. Who was she that made you forget the trysting hour was past?" "Oh, that I could discover," Mary said softly. "But her dead face was turned from me, and the mourner's face were hidden as they passed." "And if you could not see her, why did you not leave the place and hasten to me? Your curiosity was ill-advised, since you liked better the gruesome sight than my love and embraces." Mary Ryan laid her soft hand upon his arm, as though pleading forgiveness. "Now, I know not why I stayed, but some strange power drew me to follow, so I could not leave the sad corpse till it was underground." "And where did they bury the maid?" John O'Driscoll questioned, his curiosity aroused. "Behind the church upon the hill, or in St. Mary's graveyard, though I heard no keening and would have had it been so near." "Neither on the churchyard by the hill nor in St. Mary's did they bring the corpse for burial, but where the 4 crossroads do meet they dug her grave, and all silently, without prayer or cry, they closed the hard earth in upon her, and while I wept over her desolation they disappeared, so I knew not who she was or those who mourned her." Now in John O'Driscoll's heart a suspicion arose and would not be still. Sad as the sight was, it was not one to bring such tears or pallor to his sweetheart's face. Surely she had some better excuse than this, that a suicide had been buried in the four crossroads. Such a sight was not so uncommon, nor was it sufficient excuse for his long waiting. He turned upon her angrily. Was it, then, so strange a sight that you should follow like a little child attracted by a passing show, and leave me here forgotten, waiting in impatience? Mary Ryan burst into tears at his anger, and in her own terror of what she had seen. "Oh," she said fearfully, "they whispered my name as they passed. My name, each mourner that followed the corpse. I could hear it pass from lip to lip, so I had to follow. What does it mean, my John? I am frightened." John O'Driscoll rose to his feet and drew her up beside him. His lips were pressed together in a determined line. "Come," he said, "let us go and see who it was, for your tale fills me with wonder." He took her hand loosely in his, for her story had not satisfied him in its telling. And as they went on their way, they met the old priest who had the little church upon the hilltop. "Father," said John O'Driscoll, "who was the young maid they buried today, and how did death come to her?" Now the priest looked mildly through his glasses at the young pair before him. "I have heard of no death nor no burial," said he, and looked surprised. "Where did you hear the news?" "Perhaps it was a mistake," said John O'Driscoll, and there was sternness in his voice as he bid the father goodbye and drew Mary Ryan on beside him. And as they went over the little bridge leading to the crossroads, he saw, leaning over the parapet, the young priest who had the Church of St. Mary's, and he stopped and spoke. "Father," he said, "they say a maid took her life and was buried today in this crossroads. Have you heard anything of this?" "No," said the young priest, lifting his eyes from the passing waters. "What poor child has been so unfortunate?" When John O'Driscoll heard the priest's denial, he laughed, but the laugh was not good to hear. "It is but a story, father. Who told it did not speak the truth. That I know now." He tightened his hand till Mary nearly cried in the pain of his fingers, but he bid the father a gruff good day, and strode on, hurrying her after him. And so in silence they came to where the four crossroads met. When he came there, he cast his eyes upon the ground. But though the dust lay thick and white upon it, there was no sign of any disturbance, no spade mark, no track of any feet. The wind blew the white earth into little whirlpools, and lifting it into the air, tossed it far and wide over the hedges that bordered the lonesome road. John O'Driscoll looked at his sweetheart with furious eyes. She met his with a bewildered gaze, but he laughed again his ugly laugh and flung her hand from him. "That was a foolish story to tell me, Mary Ryan," he said, "and by the lie you told me today I know you for a false maid. I shall leave you now, and never shall you see me more. I am well quit of one who could so deceive her lover, for she would not be good to bring into my mother's house." With that he turned upon his heel and went his way without once looking back. When Mary heard the echo of his footsteps dying away in the distance, she crouched down in the dust, weeping. "What evil thing did I see that took my senses from me?" she cried. "To bring such misfortunes upon me, what very sight was it that it was my grief to come upon? Now my love has left me, and I no longer can live without him." She rose from the hard ground and drew her shawl about her, shivering, and down the side of the deep stream she moved. Under the crooked bridge she went, with careless feet. The young priest, who still looked into the flowing waters, started, for he thought he heard a woman crying, but when he listened again he knew it was but the moving of the stream, leaping from stone to stone or pushing aside the reeds upon the banks. For 3 days John O'Driscoll traveled over the country without stop or stay, but as far as he went and quick as he went, he seemed always to hear Mary Ryan's voice calling to him, as if in great trouble. At night her face came before him in his dreams, so he feared to sleep, and by day the longing for her came so strong he could no longer bear it, and turned his face home. In the early morning he arrived and bent his steps half unconsciously toward the last place he had seen her. He felt she would still be there, crouching in the dust as he had left her, but when he reached the place, he smiled at his own foolishness. There was no one at the crossroads to meet him. He started back as he looked around, for at his feet, cut in the hard ground, he saw a deep and narrow grave. Someone was to be buried here today. He thought of the story Mary had told him and drew his hand across his eyes in wonder. Here up the winding path, over the crooked bridge, he saw a dark procession come. He crouched beside the hedge to watch, and as he hid, he heard Mary Ryan's name whispered on the tongues of the mourners. "Poor Mary, Well it is that her mother is not alive to see her daughter buried in unholy ground. What came to her to take her innocent life? Poor Mary Ryan. But Mary passed at the head of the throng, sleeping so peacefully with a smile upon her face. No move did she make, no word did she say, even as she passed her lover so close that her shroud flapped across his cheek. Neither did she abate her strange smile when the clanging of a digging spade made him hide his face. When he raised his head, she was no more before him. The mourners, too, were going up the steep road that led to the church on the hill, some down the crooked path that led to St. Mary's. He could hear the sweet bells calling them to prayer. And before him was nothing save the white road, where the high wind lifted the dust in a soft shower and scattered it over the disturbed earth between the 4 crossroads.
The Cask of Amontillado by Edgar Allan Poe. The 1,000 injuries of Fortunato I had borne as best I could, but when he ventured upon insult, I vowed revenge. You, who so well know the nature of my soul, will not suppose, however, that I gave utterance to a threat. At length I would be avenged. This was a point definitely settled, but the very definitiveness with which it was resolved precluded the idea of risk. I must not only punish, but punish with impunity. A wrong is unredressed when retribution overtakes its redresser. It's equally unredressed when the avenger fails to make himself felt as such to him who has done the wrong. It must be understood that neither by word nor deed had I given Fortunato cause to doubt my goodwill. I continued, as was my wont, to smile in his face, and he did not perceive that my smile now was at the thought of his immolation. He had a weak point, this Fortunato, although in other regards he was a man to be respected and even feared. He prided himself on his connoisseurship in wine. Few Italians have the true virtuoso spirit. For the most part, their enthusiasm is adopted to suit the time and opportunity, to practice their imposture upon the British and Austrian millionaires. In painting and gemmery, Fortunato, like his countrymen, was a quack, but in the matter of old wines he was sincere. In this respect, I did not differ from him materially. I was skillful in the Italian vintages myself, and bought largely whenever I could. It was about dusk, one evening during the supreme madness of the Carnival season, that I encountered my friend. He accosted me with excessive warmth, for he had been drinking much. The man wore motley. He had on a tight-fitting party-striped dress, and his head was surmounted by the conical cap and bells. I was so pleased to see him that I thought I should never have done wringing his hand. I said to him, "My dear Fortunato, you are luckily met. How remarkably well you are looking today. But I have received a pipe of what passes for Amontillado, and I have my doubts." "How?" said he. "Amontillado? A pipe? Impossible! And in the middle of Carnival!" "I have my doubts," I replied, "and I was silly enough to pay the full Amontillado price without consulting you in the matter. You were not to be found, and I was fearful of losing a bargain." "Amontillado!" "I have my doubts." "Amontillado!" "And I must satisfy them." "Amontillado!" "As you are engaged, and I am on my way to Lucchesi. If anyone has a critical turn, it is he. He will tell me, 'Lucchesi cannot tell Amontillado from sherry.' And yet some fools will have it that his taste is a match for your own. Come, let us go." "Whither?" "To your vaults." "My friend, no. I will not impose upon your good nature. I perceive you have an engagement. Lucchesi—" "Oh, I have no engagement. Come." "My friend, no. It is not the engagement, but the severe cold with which I perceived you are afflicted. The vaults are insufferably damp. They are encrusted with nitre." "Let us go, nevertheless. The cold is merely nothing. Amontillado! You have been imposed upon, and as for Lucchesi, he cannot distinguish sherry from Amontillado." Thus speaking, Fortunato possessed himself of my arm. Putting on a mask of black silk and drawing a roquelaire closely about my person, I suffered him to hurry me to my palazzo. There were no attendants at home. They had absconded to make merry in honor of the time. I had told them that I should not return until the morning, and I had given them explicit orders not to stir from the house. These orders were sufficient, I well knew, to ensure their immediate disappearance, one and all, as soon as my back was turned. I took from their sconces 2 flambeaux, and giving one to Fortunato, bowed him through several suites of rooms to the archway that led into the vaults. I passed down a long and winding staircase, requesting him to be cautious as he followed. We came at length to the foot of the descent, and stood together on the damp ground of the catacombs of the Montresors. The gait of my friend was unsteady, and the bells upon his cap jingled as he strode. "The pipe," said he. "Oh, it's further on," said I. "But I observe the white web-work which gleams from these cavern walls." He turned toward me and looked into my eyes with two filmy orbs that distilled the rheum of intoxication. "Niter?" he asked at length. "Niter," I replied. "How long have you had that cough?" My poor friend found it impossible to reply for many minutes. "It is nothing," he said at last. "Come," I said with decision, "we will go back. Your health is precious. You are rich, respected, admired, beloved. You are happy, as I once was. You are a man to be missed. For me it is no matter. We will go back. You will be ill, and I cannot be responsible. Besides, there's Lucchesi." "Enough," he said. "The cough is a mere nothing. It will not kill me. I shall not die of a cough." True, I replied, and indeed I had no intention of alarming you unnecessarily, but you should use all proper caution. A draught of this medoc will defend us from the damps. Here I knocked off the neck of a bottle which I drew from a long row of its fellows that lay upon the mold. "Drink," I said, presenting him the wine. He raised it to his lips with a leer. He paused and nodded to me familiarly, while his bells jingled. "I drink," he said, "to the buried that repose around us." "And I to your long life." He once again took my arm, and we proceeded. "These vaults," he said, "are extensive." "The Montresors," I replied, "were a great and numerous family." "I forget your arms." "A human foot d'or in field azure. The foot crushes a serpent rampant whose fangs are embedded in the heel." "And the motto?" "Nemo me impune lacessit." "Good," he said. The wine sparkled in his eyes, and the bells jingled. My own fancy grew warm with the medoc. We had passed through walls of piled bones, with casks and puncheons intermingling, into the inmost recesses of the catacombs. I paused again, and this time I made bold to seize Fortunato by the arm above the elbow. "The niter," I said. "See, it increases. It hangs like moss upon the vaults. We are below the river's bed, the drop of moisture trickle among the bones. Come, we will go back ere it is too late. Your cough—" "It is nothing," he said. "Let us go on, but first, another draught of this medoc." I broke and reached him a flagon of de Grave. He emptied it at a breath. His eyes flashed with a fierce light. He laughed and threw the bottle upwards with a gesticulation I did not understand. I looked at him in surprise. He repeated the movement, a grotesque one. "You do not comprehend?" he said. "Not I," I replied. "Then you are not of the Brotherhood." "How? You are not of the Masons?" Yes, I said. Yes. "You? Impossible. A Mason?" "A Mason," I replied. "A sign," he said. "A sign." "It is this," I answered, producing a trowel from beneath the folds of my roquelaire. "You jest," he exclaimed, recoiling a few paces. "But let us proceed to the Amontillado." "Be it so," I said, replacing the tool beneath my cloak and again offering him my arm. He leaned upon it heavily. We continued our route in search of the Amontillado. We passed through a range of low arches, descended, passed on, and descending again, arrived at a deep crypt, in which the foulness of the air caused our flambeaux rather to glow than flame. At the most remote end of the crypt, there appeared another less spacious. Its walls had been lined with human remains, piled to the vault overhead in the fashion of the great catacombs of Paris. 3 sides of this interior crypt were still ornamented in this manner. From the 4th side the bones had been thrown down and lay promiscuously upon the earth, forming at one point a mound of some size. Within the wall thus exposed by the displacing of the bones, we perceived a still interior recess, in depth about 4 feet, in width 3, in height 7 or 6. It seemed to have been constructed for no especial use within itself, but formed merely the interval between 2 of the colossal supports of the roof of the catacombs, and was backed by one of the circumscribing walls with solid granite. It was in vain that Fortunato, uplifting his dull torch, endeavored to pry into the depths of the recess. Its termination the feeble light did not enable us to see. "Proceed," I said. "Herein is the Amontillado. As for Lucchesi—" "He is an ignoramus," interrupted my friend, as he stepped unsteadily forward, while I followed immediately at his heels. In an instant he had reached the extremity of the niche, and finding his progress arrested by the rock, stood stupidly bewildered. A moment more, and I'd fettered him to the granite. In its surface were 2 iron staples, distant from each other by about 2 feet horizontally. From one of these depended a short chain, from the other a padlock. Throwing the links around his waist, it was but the work of a few seconds to secure it. He was much too astounded to resist. Withdrawing the key, I stepped back from the recess. "Pass your hand," I said, over the wall, "and you cannot help feeling the niter. Indeed, it is very damp. Once more, let me implore you to return." "No? Then I must positively leave you. But I must first render you all the little attentions in my power." "The Amontillado!" ejaculated my friend, not yet recovered from his astonishment. "True," I replied, "the Amontillado." As I said these words, I busied myself among the pile of bones of which I have spoken. Throwing them aside, I soon uncovered a quantity of building stone and mortar. With these materials, and with the aid of my trowel, I began vigorously to wall up the entrance of the niche. I had scarcely laid the first tier of the masonry when I discovered that the intoxication of Fortunato had in great measure worn off. The earliest indication I had of this was a low, moaning cry from the depths of the recess. It was not the cry of a drunken man. There was then a long and obstinate silence. I laid the second tier, and the third, and the fourth, and then I heard the furious vibrations of the chain. The noise lasted for several minutes, during which, that I might hearken to it with the more satisfaction, I ceased my labors and sat down upon the bones. When at last the clanking subsided, I resumed the trowel, and finished without interrupting the 5th, the 6th, and the 7th tiers. The wall was now nearly upon a level with my breast. I again paused, and holding the flambeau over the mason work, threw a few feeble rays upon the figure within. A succession of loud and shrill screams, bursting suddenly from the throat of the chained form, seemed to thrust me violently back. For a brief moment I hesitated. I trembled. Unsheathing my rapier, I began to grope with it about the recess. But the thought of an instant reassured me. I placed my hand upon the solid fabric of the catacombs, and felt satisfied. I reapproached the wall. I replied to the yells of him who clamored. I re-echoed. I aided. I surpassed them in volume and in strength. I did this, and the clamorer grew still. It was now midnight, and my task was drawing to a close. I had completed the 8th, the 9th, and the 10th tier. I had finished a portion of the last and the 11th. There remained but a single stone to be fitted and plastered in. I struggled with its weight. I placed it partially in its destined position. But now there came from out of the niche a low laugh that erected the hairs upon my head. It was succeeded by a sad voice, which I had difficulty in recognizing that of the noble Fortunato. The voice said, "A very good joke indeed, an excellent jest. We shall have many a rich laugh about it at the palazzo, over our wine." "The Amontillado," I said. "Yes, the Amontillado, but is it not getting late? Will they not be awaiting us at the palazzo, the Lady Fortunato and the rest? Let us be gone." "Yes," I said, "let us be gone." "For the love of God, Montresor!" "Yes, for the love of God!" But to these words I hearkened in vain for a reply. I grew impatient. I called aloud, "Fortunato!" No answer. I called again, "Fortunato!" No answer still. I thrust the torch through the remaining aperture and let it fall within. There came forth in reply only a jingling of the bells. My heart grew sick on account of the dampness of the catacombs. I hastened to make an end of my labor. I forced the last stone into its position. I plastered it up. Against the new masonry, I re-erected the old rampart of bones. For the half of a century, no mortal has disturbed them. In pace requiescat.
Since I Died, by Elizabeth Stuart Phelps Ward. How very still you sit. If the shadow of an eyelash stirred upon your cheek, if that gray line about your mouth should snap its tension at this quivering end, if the pallor of your profile warmed a little, if that tiny muscle on your forehead, just at the left eyebrow's curve, should start and twitch, if you would but grow a trifle restless sitting there beneath my steady gaze, if you moved a finger of your folded hands, if you should turn and look behind your chair or lift your face, half lingering and half longing, half loving and half loath, to ponder on the annoyed and thwarted cry which the wind is making, where I stand between it and yourself against the half-closed window. Ah, there! You sigh and stir, I think. You lift your head. The little muscle is a captive still. The line about your mouth is tense and hard. The deepening hollow in your cheek has no warmer tint, I see, than the great Doric column which the moonlight builds against the wall. I lean against it. I hold out my arms. You lift your head and look me in the eye. If a shudder crept across your figure, if your arms, laid out upon the table, leaped but once above your head, if you named my name, if you held your breath with terror, or sobbed aloud for love, or sprang or cried, but you only lift your head and look me in the eye. If I dared step near, or nearer, if it were permitted that I should cross the current of your living breath, if it were willed that I should feel the leap of human blood within your veins, if I should touch your hands, your cheeks, your lips, if I dropped an arm as lightly as a snowflake round your shoulder, the fear which no heart has fathomed, the fate which no fancy has faced, the riddle which no soul has read, steps between your substance and my soul. I drop my arms. I sink into the heart of the pillared light upon the wall. I will not wonder what would happen if my outline were defined upon it to your view. I will not think of that which could be, would be, if I struck across your vision, face to face. Ah me, how still she sits! With what a fixed and curious stare she looks me in the eye. The wind, now that I stand no longer between it and yourself, comes enviously in. It lifts the curtain and whirls about the room. It bruises the surface of the great pearled pillar where I lean. I am caught within it. Speech and language struggle over me. Mute articulations fill the air. Tears and laughter, and the sounding of soft lips, and the falling of low cries possess me. Will she listen? Will she bend her head? Will her lips part in recognition? Is there an alphabet between us? Or have the winds of night a vocabulary to lift before her holden eyes? We sat many times together and talked of this. Do you remember, dear? You held my hand. Tears that I could not see fell on it. We sat by the great hall window upstairs, where the maple shadow goes to sleep, face down across the floor upon a lighted night. The old green curtain waved its hands upon us like a mesmerist, I thought. Like a priest, you said. When we are parted, you shall go, you said. And when I shook my head, you smiled. You always smiled when you said that, but you said it always quite the same. I think I hardly understood you then. Now that I hold your eyes in mine, and you see me not. Now when I stretch my hand and you touch me not. Now that I cry your name and you hear it not. I comprehend you, tender one. A wisdom not of earth was in your words. To live is dying. I will die. To die is life, and you shall live. Now when the fever turned, I thought of this. That must have been, how long ago. I miss the conception of that for which how long stands index. Yet I perfectly remember that I perfectly understood it to be at 3 o'clock on a rainy Sunday morning that I died. Your little watch stood in its case of olive wood upon the table, and drops were on the window. I noticed both, though you did not know it. I see the watch now in your pocket. I cannot tell if the hands move or only pulsate like a heart-throb to and fro. They stand and point, mute golden fingers, paralyzed and pleading, forever at the hour of 3. At this I wonder. When first you said I was sinking fast, the words sounded as old and familiar as a nursery tale. I heard you in the hall. The doctor had just left, and you went to Mother and took her face in your 2 arms, and laid your hand across her mouth, as if it were she who had spoken. She cried out and threw up her thin old hands, but you stood as still as eternity. And I thought again, it is she who dies, I shall live. So often and so anxiously we have talked of this thing called death, that now that it is all over between us, I cannot understand why we found in it such a source of distress. It bewilders me. I am often bewildered here. Things and the fancies of things possess a relation which as yet is new and strange to me. Here is a mystery. Now, in truth, it seems a simple matter for me to tell you how it has been with me since your lips last touched me, and your arms held me to the vanishing air. Oh, drawn, pale lips, nerveless, dropping arms. I told you I would come. Did ever promise fail I spoke to you? Come and show me death, you said. I have come to show you death. I could show you the fairest sight and sweetest that ever blessed your eyes. Why, look, is it not fair? Am I terrible? Do you shrink or shiver? Would you turn from me or hide your strained, expectant face? Would she? Does she? Will she? Ah, how the room widened. I could tell you that. It grew great and luminous day by day. At night the walls throbbed. Lights of rose ran round them, and blue fire, and a tracery as of the shadows of little leaves. As the walls expanded, the air fled. But I tried to tell you how little pain I knew or feared. Your haggard face bent over me. I could not speak. When I would, I struggled, and you said, "She suffers." Dear, it was so very little. Listen till I tell you how that night came on. The sun fell, and the dew slid down. It seemed to me that it slid into my heart, but still I felt no pain. Where the walls pulsed and receded, the hills came in. Where the old bureau stood above the glass, I saw a single mountain with a face of fire and purple hair. I tried to tell you this, but you said, "She wanders." I laughed in my heart at that, for it was such a blessed wandering. As the night locked the sun below the mountain's solemn, watching face, the gates of space were lifted up before me. The everlasting doors of matter swung for me upon their rusty hinges, and the King of Glories entered in and out. All the kingdoms of the earth and the power of them beckoned to me. Across the mist my failing senses made. Ruins and roses, and the brows of Jura, and the singing of the Rhine, a shaft of red light on the Sphinx's smile, and caravans in sandstorms, and an icy wind at sea, and golden mines that no man knew, and mothers sitting at their doors in valleys singing babes to sleep, and women in dank cellars selling souls for bread, and the whir of wheels in giant factories, and a single prayer somewhere in a den of death. I could not find it, though I searched, and the smoke of battle, and broken music, and a sense of lilies alone beside a stream at the rising of the sun. And at last, your face, dear, all alone. I discovered then that the walls and roof of the room had vanished quite. The night wind blew in. The maple in the yard almost brushed my cheek. Stars were about me, and I thought the rain had stopped, yet seemed to hear it upon the seaming of a window which I could not find. One thing only hung between me and immensity. It was your single, awful, haggard face. I looked my last into your eyes. Stronger than death, they held and claimed my soul. I feebly raised my hand to find your own. More cruel than the grave, your wild grasp chained me. Then I struggled, and you cried out, and your face slipped, and I stood free. I stood upon the floor beside the bed. That which had been I lay there at rest, but terrible before me. You hid your face, and I saw you slide upon your knees. I laid my hand upon your head. You did not stir. I spoke to you. "Dear, look around a minute." But you knelt quite still, I walked to and fro about the room, and meeting my mother, touched her on the elbow. She only said, "She's gone," and sobbed aloud. "I have not gone," I cried, but she sat sobbing on. The walls of the room had settled now, and the ceiling stood in its solid place. The window was shut, but the door stood open. Suddenly I was restless, and I ran. I brushed you in hurrying by, and hit the little light stand where the tumblers stood. I looked to see if it would fall, but it only shivered as if a breath of wind had struck it once. But I was restless, and I ran. In the hall I met the doctor. This amused me, and I stopped to think it over. "Ah, doctor," said I, "you need not trouble yourself to go up. I'm quite well tonight, you see." But he made me no answer. He gave me no glance. He hung up his hat and laid his hand upon the banister against which I leaned, and went ponderously up. It was not until he had nearly reached the landing that it occurred to me, still leaning on the banister, that his heavy arm must have swept against and through me, where I stood against the oaken moldings which he grasped. I saw his feet fall on the stairs above me, but they made no sound which reached my ear. "You'll not disturb me now with your big boots, sir," said I, nodding. "Never fear." But he disappeared from sight above me, and still I heard no sound. Now the doctor had left the front door unlatched. As I touched it, it blew wide open and solemnly. I passed out and down the steps. I could see that it was chilly, yet I felt no chill. Frost was on the grass, and in the east a pallid streak, like the cheek of one who had watched all night. The flowers in the little square plots hung their heads and drew their shoulders up. There was a lonely late lily which I broke and gathered to my heart, where I breathed upon it, and it warmed and looked me kindly in the eye. This, I remember, gave me pleasure. I wandered in and out about the garden in the scattering rain. My feet left no trace upon the dripping grass, and I saw with interest that the garment which I wore gathered no moisture and no cold. I sat musing for a while upon the piazza, in the garden chair, not caring to go in. It was so many months since I had felt able to sit upon the piazza in the open air. By and by, I thought, I would go in and upstairs to see you once again. The curtains were drawn from the parlor windows, and I passed and repassed, looking in. All this while the cheek of the east was warming, and the air gathering faint heats and lights about me. I remembered presently the old arbor at the garden foot where, before I was sick, we sat so much together, and thinking, she will be surprised to know that I have been down alone. I was restless, and I ran again. I meant to come back and see you, dear, once more. I saw the lights in the room where I had lain sick overhead, and your shadow on the curtain, and I blessed it with all the love of life and death as I bounded by. The air was thick with sweetness from the dying flowers. The birds woke, and the zenith lighted, and the leap of health was in my limbs. The old arbor held out its soft arms to me, but I was restless, and I ran. The field opened before me, and meadows with broad bosoms, and a river flashed before me like a scimitar, and woods interlocked their hands to stay me, but being restless, on I ran. The house dwindled behind me, and the light in my sick room and your shadow on the curtain, but yet I was restless, and I ran. In the twinkling of an eye I fell into a solitary place. Sand and rocks were in it, and a falling wind. I paused and knelt upon the sand, and mused a little in this place. I mused of you, and life, and death, and love, and agony, but these had departed from me, as dim and distant as the fainting wind. A sense of solemn expectation filled the air. A tremor and a trouble wrapped my soul. I must be dead, I said aloud. I had no sooner spoken than I learned that I was not alone. The sun had risen, and on a ledge of ancient rock, weather-stained and red, there had fallen over against me the outline of a presence lifted up against the sky, and turning suddenly I saw, lawful to utter, but utterance has fled. Lawful to utter, but a greater than law restrains me. Am I blotted from your desolate fixed eyes? Lips that my mortal lips have pressed, can you not quiver when I cry? Soul that my eternal soul has loved, can you stand enveloped in my presence, and not spring like a fountain to me? Would you not know how it has been with me since your perishable eyes beheld my perished face? What my eyes have seen, or my ears have heard, or my heart conceived without you? If I have missed or mourned for you? If I have watched or longed for you? Marked your solitary days and sleepless nights and tearless eyes, and monotonous slow echo of my unanswering name? Would you not know? Alas, would she? Would she not? My soul misgives me with a matchless solitary fear. I am called and I slip from her. I am beckoned and I lose her. Her face dims and her folded lonely hands fade from my sight. Time to tell her a guarded thing. Time to whisper a treasured word. A moment to tell her that death is dumb, for life is death. A moment to tell her,
The Closing Hand by Farnsworth Wright. Solitary and forbidding, the house stared, spectre-like, through scraggly trees that seemed to shrink from its touch. The green moss of decay lay on its dank roofs, and the windows, set in deep cavities, peered blindly at the world as if through eyeless sockets. So forbidding was its aspect that boys, on approaching its cheerless gables, stopped their whistling and passed on the opposite side of the street. Across the fields, a few huddled cottages gazed through the falling rain, as if wondering what family could be so bold as to take up its abode within the gloomy walls of that old mansion, whose carpetless floors for 2 years had not felt the tread of human feet. In an attic room of the house, 2 sisters lay in bed, but not asleep. The younger sister cringed under the dread inspired by the bleak place. The elder laughed at her childish fears, but the younger felt the spell of the old building and was afraid. I suppose there is really nothing to frighten me in this dreary old house, she admitted, without conviction in her voice. But the very feel of the place is horrible. Mother shouldn't have left us alone in this gruesome place. Stupid, her sister scolded. With all the silverware downstairs, somebody has to be here for fear of burglars. Oh, don't talk about burglars, pleaded the younger girl. I am afraid. I keep imagining I hear ghostly footsteps. Her sister laughed. Go to sleep, Goosey, she said. Haunted houses are nothing but superstition. They exist only in imagination. Why has nobody lived here for 2 years then? They tell me that for 5 years every family moved out after being here just a short time. The whole atmosphere of the house is ghastly, and I can't forget how the older Berkheim girl was found stabbed to death in her bed, and nobody ever knew how it happened. Why, she may have been murdered in this very room. Go to sleep and don't scare yourself with such silly talk. Mother will be with us tomorrow night, and Dad will be back the next day. Now go to sleep. The elder sister soon dropped into slumber, but the younger lay open-eyed, staring into the black room and shuddering at every stifled scream of the wind or distant growl of thunder. She began to count, hoping to hypnotize herself into drowsiness. but at every slight noise she started and lost her count. Suddenly, she turned and shook her sister by the shoulder. "Edith, somebody is prowling around downstairs," she whispered. "Listen, oh, what shall we do?" The elder sister struck a match and lit the candle. Then she slipped on her dressing gown and drew on her slippers. "You're not going down there, Edith. Tell me you're not going downstairs. It might be that murdered Berkheim girl. Edith, don't." Edith shot a glance of withering scorn at her sister, who lay on the bed with blanched face and wide, terrified eyes. "There is something moving around downstairs, and I'm going to find out what it is," she said. Taking the candle, she left the room. Her younger sister lay in the darkness, listening to the pattering of rain on the roof and straining her ears to catch the slightest sound. The noise downstairs ceased, but the wind rose, and the rain beat upon the roof in sudden furious blasts that made her heart jump wildly. 10 minutes passed. 20 minutes, and Edith had not returned. A door slammed, and the younger sister thought she heard something moving again, but the wind began to sob and drowned out all other noises. Between gusts, she heard the portentous sound, and each time it seemed nearer. Then she started as she realized that something was coming up the stairs. Once she thought she heard a cry to which the wind joined its plaintive voice in a weird duet. Nearer and nearer the strange noise came. It mounted the stairs, step by step, heard only when the wind and rain softened their voices. It passed the first landing and moved slowly up the second flight, while the girl fearfully awaited its coming. The wind howled until the house quaked. It shrilled past the eaves and fled across the fields like a hunted ghost. And now the girl's pounding pulses drowned out the screaming of the wind, for the presence had invaded her bedroom. She cowered under the covers, a cold perspiration chilling her body until her teeth chattered. Her imagination conjured up frightful things. A disembodied spirit come to destroy her. A corpse from the grave, gibbering in terror because it could not tear the cerements from its face. The murdered Berkheim girl with a knife still sheathed in her heart, or some escaped beast licking its lips in greedy anticipation of the feast her tremulous body would provide. Or was it a murderer who, having killed her sister, was now bent on completing his bloody work? A flash of lightning split the sky, and the thunder bellowed its terrifying warning. The girl threw back the bedclothes and shrank to the wall, her eyes starting from their sockets, fearful lest another flash reveal some sight too ghastly to contemplate. Slowly, the being dragged itself across the floor, lifted itself onto the bed, and uttered a choking sound of agony. The girl sat petrified. Then, timorously, she extended a shaky hand, but quickly withdrew it in dread of some hideous contact. Again, she thrust her trembling hand into the gloom, farther, until it touched something shaggy and wet. A clammy hand closed over hers, and she started to her feet with a horrified scream. The icy hand tightened with a sickening tremor and dragged her down. Then her tortured senses gave way, and she fell back unconscious upon the bed. When she awoke, it was day. Beside her, on the bed, lay the bleeding body of her sister, Edith, stabbed in the breast by the burglar she had tried to frighten away. The younger sister was clutching the clotted wisps of hair that had fallen across the breast of her sister, whose cold hand had closed over hers in the last convulsive shudder of death.